We'll go
Good
for sleep
evening.
now.
Welcome to UK Crime Book Club. And this evening, I'm delighted to be joined by author Lucy Banks, who is also my friend. So I have to give a disclaimer on that one. Lucy and I met many years ago over a love of books. And then since we've blogged together and worked together, and you've carried on writing, and I've moved away from libraries. You haven't, have you?
No, I'm still in the heart of libraries, yeah, but I don't think you ever really leave libraries, do you, Karen? It's always in your
No.
heart.
Yeah. They say, well, I say quite often, I'll say, oh, you can take the girl out of the library, but you can't take the library out of the girl.
Yeah, that's about right.
So, tell us about The Depths, because that's out now. And it's I was trying to work out what number book it is, actually.
Do you know, I think it's the eighth.
That's amazing, isn't it?
I
Eighth
know, I
book.
know.
Yeah.
I had to do a little bit of a intake of breath at that one because it doesn't feel like eight, but I think because the first one was the series, I sort of smushed them together a bit in my
Yeah.
brain.
Yeah. And then, yeah, then you had the sort of psychological, the one that was set about the girl. I can't, birds, little cage bird, which was
Cage
a couple
Little
of years
Birds,
ago.
yeah,
Cage little bird,
yeah.
that's it. Yeah,
Yes, I
yeah.
was trying to
So
remember when we talked about that one, Karen, because that was that a couple of years ago now? It must have been, mustn't it?
I think it was. Yeah, yeah. I think it was.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. It was a couple of years.
time
So
flies.
I know, scary. So The Depths is published with Bloodhound Books, which is a new publisher for you as well.
It is a new publisher for me. Yeah, I feel like I've been sort of here, there, and everywhere with publishers, and I've sort of had a bit of bad luck really because the first publishers in America obviously went bust, and then over
Oh
here the
no.
same thing happened with Sandstone. Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah, so I hope I'm not the curse. I'm starting to feel like maybe publishers should see me
Third
coming
time
as
lucky.
well.
Yeah, don't say that. They'll be all going, oh no, don't have a. No, I think
But
it's
yes,
just unfortunately it's just like the climate, isn't it, of
yes,
publishing really.
yeah.
And there's been several indie presses that have had to close, sadly.
I know, it really is sad, isn't it? But Bloodhound have been lovely to work with, and I think because they're so sort of very crime, they're really
Yeah,
sort of one of the homes of crime, aren't they? So
yeah,
it definitely
definitely.
felt like a good match for this one.
Yeah. So can you tell us in your words about The Depths and sort of the outline of it, because we'll dig into it in a minute a little bit more, but sort of, yeah, the sort of brief outline.
Yeah, I always find this a really challenging question actually, because you can't actually say too much because obviously
No.
there's quite a few twists and turns there. But it's about a couple called Heidi and Vinny, and when we first meet them in the book, they're off to Cornwall. They've bought a house in Cornwall, which is dilapidated by the sea, but it's far from that sort of idyllic buying a new home and turning it into something fantastic. And you realize pretty swiftly on in the book, I think, that all is not right in their relationship and that they're actually
Yeah.
fleeing something. And then start to learn about Vinny's previous relationship with a woman called Noelle, and what exactly has happened to Noelle is kept quite the secret for a while. Puts enormous tension on Vinny and Heidi's relationship with quite sort of disastrous consequences, and then sort of much of the book is focused on Heidi on her own, really, initially sort of fending for herself in this quite hostile environment, and then obviously things unfold from there, Karen, which I can't say too much
They
about.
do. They do indeed, and it is going to be a tricky one to talk about. But I think we can sort of skirt around the sort of, we can talk about character, we can talk about the setting, which I think are both really integral to the book, aren't they? So, what
Yeah,
I'm sort of the setting in Cornwall and the sort of dilapidated house. I was thinking, because I knew that you'd moved, hadn't you? And I was like, were you inspired by your own I know you didn't move to Cornwall, but were you inspired by your own sort of experiences for this book, or was it something else?
Yeah, I think it was this move, but it was also a previous move as well. So you're absolutely right. I've now moved to the coast, and I think
Yeah.
even though Exmouth in Devon is obviously very, very different to the wild Cornish coast, yes,
Yeah.
I think there was something in that. But it was actually very much inspired. Gosh, I think it was about 15 years ago. I moved to Dorset, Dorchester, and we bought a dilapidated house. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of the horror I felt at having to do that up ourselves with, I mean, there was one nightmarish day where flies started pouring in through the kitchen ceiling, and like real sort of horror show stuff,
Oh
which definitely
God.
stuck in my head. So yeah, that 100% fed into this book of that feeling of like a house which is meant to feel so comforting, suddenly feeling so hostile.
Not
Yeah.
yeah. And it does. I mean, she's like the first days they're there. And I bought my first house that I bought was very much like that. And I could sort of remember the first night we moved in. It was so we had old metal windows, and it was so windy that the light on the wall was blowing on the inside.
Yeah.
So I mean, sorry.
Yeah, I think there's a lot around that, is that sort of that discomfort which I think runs through the book of I've always been sort of interested in that idea of the places where we feel safe and what happens if you don't feel safe there anymore. So I think there's a lot of that, but also sort of, I guess, sort of as a metaphor for your own head as well. And I think it's probably fair to say Heidi doesn't feel safe in her own head. Again, without saying too much.
No, we won't say too much about her. We'll come back to her in a minute, because the house and the setting is really atmospheric, and I think really integral, isn't it, to that sort of the whole thing. Really, the whole book is sort of it's not about the house, but it is about the house in a way. There is certain bits about, isn't there, in the book that is about very much about the house, and what happens. Was that sort of based on anywhere real, or because I was sort of imagining this sort of cliff house, and the sort of the tunnel, which there's a tunnel. Yeah. So what was that? Was that sort of, where did that sort of inspiration come from?
Yes, I think when I was a child, we used to go to Cornwall pretty much on holiday every year, bar a few years. So it was always a place that I held really dear. And I think in those formative years, the craggy cliffs and the waves sort of smashing against them, there was something about that extreme wildness of that landscape that really appealed to me.
Yeah.
But I think reflecting back on it as well, always that awareness of being the outsider that's going into Cornwall, of the classic, what do they call them down there? Emmets, isn't it? You're an Emmet.
Emmett
You go
there,
on holiday,
Brockle's here, and Emmett's there.
but that feeling as well, I think, was something I called back on quite a bit. Yeah, so I think definitely in terms of the place in general, caves as well. That's fascinating, isn't it, Karen? Because I often find myself going into caves. There's been caves in other books as well that I've done. I think, what does that mean? Why do I keep going back to caves in my writings? But yeah, I mean, certainly as a kid, again, caves are great, aren't they? They're fascinating, spooky places.
Yeah, and I wonder as well whether they're like quite a lot of sort of films and things in the in books where there's I'm thinking of even like Agatha Christie, where you've got evil under the sun, and quite often there's sort of wrongdoings happening in caves, illicit drug deals, and all those sorts of things. So I think it really does lend itself, doesn't it, to that sort of peril and mystery.
Yeah, and I think it's something about Cornish caves as well, isn't it? Because it's so tied up in that history with the smugglers' caves, and I definitely, as a child, I bought into all of that. I had these lovely images of pirates sort of sailing in, and that definitely fed into the depths.
And I think that's sort of the story. So Vinny's sort of fascinated, isn't he? He finds out quite early that that the people who own the house before, or the people in the village, they call it the death house, don't they? When she goes to the shop, they call it the death house, and apparently it's been on the market for years and nobody's bought it, and you don't know why nobody's bought it. And then you find out that you know, that the people who lived there before, there was a tunnel and they sort of boarded it up. But he becomes sort of obsessed with getting it open, doesn't he? And finding out what's down there. And that side of it that's for me when it became really creepy, because it is quite dark.
Again, yeah. Sorry, Karen, I did it again.
Well, I think it's the folklore. Is it called the what's the it's not like a piss, it is like a pixie. Nixie, that's it. But yeah. So was that something that you read about? Did you sort of make it up?
I think a lot of my stories start from folklore or history. And full disclosure, I think one of the places I find most of my ideas is actually, there's a few podcasts I listen to, but one that's particularly useful for this sort of thing is called Lore. I don't know if you've heard of it. An American presenter, I think his name's Aaron Menke or something like that. But he does these fantastically sort of in-depth explorations into these legends, and not just from America but all around the world, including Devon, Cornwall as well. Cool. So that actually the Nixie, I think, was from one of his, and that just really struck something in me because it's connected to what's the legend of the crying woman in South America? I want to say Yoranda, famous. This idea of the water sprite that sort of lures men in, particularly men for some reason, and then drags them down to their watery depths. So it often for me it starts with those weird little folkloric tales, and then it sort of spirals out from there, but often not with a supernatural ending. So even though it starts with something supernatural, it ends up completely different.
Well, because that's the thing, isn't it? It's like it's that sort of feeling of uneasiness because you don't know, do you? You don't know. And I think I was really interested in how you sort of got that feeling of unease and creepiness through the book. And was that something that you sort of worked on as you went through, or is that something that sort of comes naturally to you?
Let's hope it doesn't come naturally to me. I think it's like with Caged Little Birds as well, as I find the interior really interesting, like what's going on in the head. And I think a lot of the unease comes from that, of actually, throughout the book, a lot of what Heidi experiences, you're not quite sure, is that just her interpretation? Is that how she's feeling about things that's projecting outwards? So I think that's for me where I see that point of unease, really, that balance between like, is this real or is she just completely sort of fantasizing it all because she's not in a good place?
I think if you've got that sort of mind where you remember, you sort of can understand that sort of feeling, or that feeling of trepidation, and you hear the noises and you don't know what's going on and that sort of thing. Because I think I can be quite scared by things, and quite often it's things. It's nothing, is it? Because it's the unknown is more scary than actually reading something that is sort of written down to be scary. It's what's not said.
It's exactly that, isn't it? And tapping into that fear that we all have, and then obviously the relief when we find out it's not anything scary. I remember a time when I stayed in a cottage in Cornwall, and the whole night I was sat there rigid with fear because I could hear scratching on the window, and of course it was a tree in the wind, wasn't it? As soon as I opened the curtains the next day, it was like, oh yeah. But in the night, it's that feeling, isn't it? It feels really real and unnerving, and I think that's quite sort of fertile ground for me. I quite like exploring that feeling.
I think the thing is as well is if you've like stayed places. I remember we stayed in a house in North Wales, which was right up in the mountains on its own, and I terrify myself that we're sort of 3 miles away from anybody, and what happens if somebody comes up in the middle of the night, and we had no phone signal, no phone, and it's that the sort of your imagination goes override, doesn't it? So I guess that's sort of like that sort of helps when you can do that. When you do that, that's when you can sort of drip feed those bits into the book for the readers to sort of pick up on and maybe read it even differently than you sort of intended it to be.
Yeah, well, I think that's it. I think there's definitely a truth there in nobody is able to frighten us as much as we can frighten ourselves.
Yeah.
100%. But yeah, also sort of in the depths, really, I tried to play around with that idea of A, is this real? But B, is there something in here of a deserving just reward? Of that psychological torment, is it something that
Yeah.
actually was coming? And
Yeah.
yeah.
Because coming to the characters, so we briefly touched them. So we've got Vinny, who's Heidi's boyfriend. You know that something sort of, they've sort of got together quite quickly, had a bit of a whirlwind romance, but they've bought this house, and even from the first pages, isn't it? It's not, that something's not right, without giving away. Well, you don't really know what's happened. You know that that she sort of befriended the girlfriend, and sort of that they knew that. She knew that she was intent on sort of breaking them up, wasn't she? She sort of thought that she was much better than her. And I was really interested with that sort of dynamic between the three of them. But obviously we don't know, but actually there's so much unsaid, isn't there? We do sort of like pop back, don't we? So I was interested from the first did you always know you would write it from her perspective, from Heidi's perspective? Was that sort of always what you planned?
Yeah, and I think it's something I did with Caged Little Birds as well, because it really gets you inside their head, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which makes for uncomfortable writing.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have said Heidi was as uncomfortable to write as Ava in Caged Little Birds, though. I think there's something about Heidi that she's quite almost gleeful about her own behaviour. She takes a bit of delight in it, I think. Or rather, she's a woman who knew very much what she wanted and just went out and took it. But yeah, there's definitely a discomfort, I think, in that first person writing, when you are writing a character that isn't necessarily particularly likable, that has reactions that aren't particularly natural, shall we say.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something. For these two, I'm really glad I wrote these books, and it's fantastic to explore characters like that. But I have sworn for the next one I'm going to write someone likable, just to make sure I can do it, Karen. Otherwise, I don't know what that says about me.
Well, the thing is with Ava, she was very from Caged Little Birds. Ava was complicated, wasn't she? And
yes.
and I guess Heidi's complicated to a certain extent, but not to the degree that Ava was.
No, I think Heidi's quite straightforward, actually.
Yeah.
In her motivations, she knew exactly what she wanted.
She knew exactly what she wanted, and she went after it. And I found it really interesting was that she was like, she sort of looks at him differently, doesn't she? She almost asks herself, well, why did I feel this way about him before? Because now, she's sort of, saying about what he looks like and what he dresses like and all those sorts of things. And you think, well, they haven't been together that long. But then the interesting part is that sort of, that something, it sort of gets their relationship, even in a short period of time, deteriorates quite quickly. And then Rick comes along, and he's quite interesting. I was like, oh, hello. She doesn't hang around, does she?
Well, exactly. I think she is that character, isn't she? It's like, oh, here's a shiny new thing. Right, I'm going to go for that instead. I think that's very much her dynamic. But I think I deliberately didn't want to make Rick too sympathetic either.
No.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? That's the truth with people, is we're all complicated, and I think as readers we often want to categorize into like, oh, they're a nice character, they're bad, but actually life often doesn't showcase that, does it? So it was sort of about that, really, of yes, all of them I think behave in dodgy ways, shall we say, to varying degrees.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I think that sort of that you start off with those two, and then other people come into the story that are quite integral to the sort of bigger picture, without giving too much away, and they get and then people start to sort of ask questions about their relationship, and and what what Heidi's going through, and what she's what she feels like she's going through, and yeah, I found that sort of really fascinating, that sort of getting inside her head, but also getting inside the head of the other people that come in and question what's going on and what's happened to them. It's really difficult to talk about, but
Karen, it's one of those things, isn't it?
But did you sort of, when you sort of plotted the book, did you always know which direction it would go, or were you sort of quite surprised at how things changed plot wise as you went along?
Yeah, I think for the most part I had a pretty fair idea with this one, because again, without saying too much, it was that legend of the Nixie that sort of formed the foundations of this. So I did kind of always have an idea of where Heidi would end up. But it's always the way, I think, with these sort of character-led stories, sometimes they do lead you in slightly unexpected directions. And I think particularly around the relationship with Rick, that wasn't how I saw that at all, but that's how it very naturally sort of went, so I ran with it. Again, without saying too much, Heidi suddenly doesn't have the upper hand anymore. And I think in my head I saw her as being more that, sort of winning throughout the book, but actually she starts to lose quite early on in the book, and things start to go wrong quite quickly.
Well, I think, as you said, she's always sort of got her own way, and she's always got people to perceive her the way that she wants them to perceive her, and that does change quite dramatically, doesn't it? And with people that she's really shocked, without giving away too much, that really shocks her to the core when she finds out that people that she thought she could trust, she really couldn't.
Because I think I kind of wrote her with a bit of childlike to her. There's something really, really straightforward and black and white about her, of like, it's either this or it's this. And as a result, I think that is kind of her undoing, really, as she makes assumptions throughout the book that
she is quite sort of naive, isn't she, in a way, that she's she's naive, and she's also sort of arrogant, I guess, in a way, because she believes her own hype so much. She
does. She was fun to write, actually. Fun and uncomfortable in equal measures, definitely.
Did you sort of, like, did those characters, and Noelle, I thought she was interesting, like, as sort of the mysterious ex that you don't really know a huge amount about. You find out a little bit more about her as the book progresses. But did you want her to be sort of a mystery sort of character that sort of, we didn't really know too much about?
Yeah, I think it was almost so. Noelle is a very sort of shadowy character throughout. You don't get to know her at all. There's never any sort of anything from her perspective at all. It's all very much guesswork as to what's going on in her head. But the reason I chose to show her like that is because I think it's through Heidi's eyes, and Heidi doesn't want to acknowledge she's a person.
I hadn't thought of that, actually.
I think there's kind of a jealousy there that hopefully still comes through by how she talks about Noelle when she's reflecting on the past. So I think that's the thing with all the characters. It's getting that balance again of, like, because it's first person narrative, it's seeing it through Heidi's eyes, but also making sure the reader sees what the characters are really like as well. It's always a bit
I think that's the thing, isn't it? You almost get dragged into that sort of what she's thinking, and then when you find out otherwise, you think, oh yeah, I've forgotten that she's, that it's not all, because we never find out, we see what's happening through her eyes and how she perceives things, and so we only actually ever hear, like, her side of the story. But then there is other sides of the story that come in, I think I can say that, that we begin to sort of find out more about the life they had before, and why they've sort of ended up coming down to Cornwall out of the way of everybody. Because she does sort of, she does say quite early on, isn't it, that they're escaping from something, and you don't know what that is. But the tension in their relationship is not good, is it?
No, I think right from the start. Yeah, I think right from the start, hopefully the reader really twigs that something is not
Yeah.
as it should be here. Yeah, again, it's another interesting one because obviously the phrase unreliable narrator comes up a lot with
Yeah.
characters like this. And it was something I was chatting to someone else about recently, and I realized there's different sorts of unreliable narrator, aren't there? Which in itself is fascinating, I think. But I think
Yeah.
with Heidi, it's a character who, as you said earlier, believes her own hype.
Yeah.
So I think there's almost a sense of she's not deliberately trying to be unreliable, but that she is
No.
genuinely kind of believing the stuff that's coming out of her mouth.
And she
Which,
does seem genuinely shocked, doesn't she, when she's challenged for one
yeah,
reason or another. You
yeah,
know, when she goes to the shop and, you know, B, who owns the shop or works in the shop, is not, you know, she's particularly sort of, I could imagine that sort of, you know, moving into a small village, you come in and you know, well, you've bought the house, and you know, she's not very welcoming to her to start with, which again sort of adds to the fact that, you know, he's sort of like left her to go to the shop on her own, and she comes back and she sort of almost expects to be welcomed with open arms, and is quite sort of put out that, you know, that she was quite rude to her, and you know, in her head she was, well, in
yeah,
her perspective she was quite rude to her.
yeah, yeah. And I think that is the case throughout, is that she just doesn't get it. She doesn't get why people question her at the end. She doesn't. I
Yeah.
think even right at the end, when you know it all sort of blows up,
Yeah.
I think she still doesn't get it, really.
Because I think that's the other thing I thought with it, was that it's quite, because we sort of join them obviously quite a way into to what's happened, and I think that's sort of like you sort of start to sort of think, well, you know, what has happened before. We obviously know, you will obviously pick up quite quickly that it's that they're not in the sort of throes of, you know, of young love now, are they? Something's happened and they've come down here, and nothing seems joyful about the experience. That, you know, part completely the opposite. And was that sort of the scene you wanted to set, like from the start, was that, you know, this is not right, there's something not going well here?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Karen, because I'd say that's, excuse me, one of the hardest things that I found about this book is writing about relationships and intimate relationships, not
Yeah.
necessarily just the sex side of things, but that sort of very closeted intimacy of two people in a space
Yeah.
on their own. That's not actually something I've really done before in any of my other books. So
No.
yeah, particularly a relationship sort of in its final throes,
Yeah.
which was built on very wobbly foundations anyway. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? As an author, they always say, write what you know. This isn't something, unfortunately, I don't know this, you know, I've got a very happy marriage. This is not something I'm familiar with. And it actually, again, it feels quite uncomfortable sort of picking in to
Yeah.
that process of a relationship disintegrating.
Because you
Um,
do go into quite, you know, you go into quite a lot of detail, and I sort of found that really interesting, because that sort of psychological thriller bit. But you know, you sort of, you know, I don't think it's giving away too much to know that he sort of disappears quite quickly. And I was quite surprised, but then I thought, well, actually, we don't know how long this has been going on. You know, this is not, you know, it has taken to the point they've moved house, but, you know, actually, how long was it before, and those sort of things. So I thought that was quite interesting.
yeah, yeah, and I think something about that sort of workplace romance as well, of, you know, that's a scenario that's been played out many times before in various TV series, hasn't it? I mean, it's quite a trope in a way, but sort of uh, turning it on its head. So it's you know, it's something that crumbles, and
Yeah.
probably because they are two quite, I think it's fair to say, selfish characters.
Yeah.
There's none of that sort of spirit of compromise with the two of them, is there, of making that relationship work? It's very much what they both want.
Well, actually, for him, I found him really interesting, because he's a real mummy's boy, isn't he?
Yeah,
He's sort of, yeah. I found that really fascinating, the sort of relationship he's got with his mother. And we don't really, again, in the beginning of the book, we sort of, she's mentioned, he talks about her, doesn't he? But they haven't met. Heidi and Vinny's mother haven't met before.
Yeah.
But he does mention her in the beginning of the book. He does sort of say about her and, you know, about speaking to her, and so, but actually as the book progresses, that he does come across as quite the mummy's boy. And, you know, particularly with what happens, I was like, oh, for goodness sake. So yeah.
He absolutely is. He was fun to write, actually, because he's not only the mummy's boy, and I deliberately made their names very, very similar as a bit of a joke, because she's called Vivian and he's called Vinny.
Yeah.
She's a very narcissistic maternal figure, of that sort of narcissism of naming the child really closely after yourself.
Yeah.
But he's also very much this sort of the golden boy, you know, he's well in the workplace, he's used to succeeding in life. And I guess that sort of characterizing him, so he shrinks almost. And I think I do describe it at some point as he's like shrunken in on himself.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden going from being this success in the workplace, you know, doing amazingly well in his career, to suddenly all he's obsessed with is opening up this weird little tunnel in his garden. You know, it's sort of that real diminishing of him, I think, of like a child. I do often use the word toddler to describe him as well. That's sort of his tantrum. And
I mean, like you said about, like, they're not none of them are. Nobody in the book is. I'm trying to think if anybody. I mean, I didn't dislike Rick, actually. I thought he was. But I mean, most of them are. I don't know, dislikable, but they're not sort of. But actually, I think I quite like that in a book. I quite like characters that aren't, you know, that you just, because it makes it more interesting, doesn't it? And actually, if they get their comeuppance, if they're not very likable, it makes it all the more joyful, I think. Well, that could just be me.
It's been really interesting to me, because I've had that comment about Caged Little Birds and The Depths, is that the characters aren't very likable, and I fully agree with that. But interestingly, with Caged Little Birds, I think that caused more discomfort, and I think there's been something about The Depths that, as you said, there's something a little bit more gleeful and joyous about it. About the fact that, yes, these are characters that are morally reprehensible, that do all sorts of not very good things. But as you say, it's that end, isn't it, that ties it all up nicely, and hopefully the reader then comes away and goes, ha.
Yeah, I did. I went, ha, at the end. Did you were you sort of surprised at any point with, you know, was there any things in there that you sort of, you know, you didn't think was going to end up in there? Was there anybody that sort of came along, you know, that you, or was it pretty true to what you sort of started out to achieve?
I think rather unusually for me, this one was pretty true to what I envisaged it. I think the only thing was, originally Vinny was a much bigger force within the book, and I'd say a more malign force.
Right.
But actually writing him like that, just it took something away. So I sort of pulled him right back out of it, really, and let Heidi do the talking. But other than that, no, I think this was an unusual one for me, Karen, and I didn't have to rewrite it 3 times.
So was it a quick write for you, this one?
This one, yeah, compared to my usual, it was. Normally I zoom through a first draft really, really quickly, and then spend about 2 years rewriting it, editing it. Yeah, it always seems to work out that way. And then sending it off to the publishers, and they say, yeah, there's about 5 massive plot holes there, Lucy. Take it away, do it again. But yeah, no, The Depths happily wasn't one of those books, which made a nice change. Yeah.
But the other thing is that you work as well. This isn't just what you do, is it? You work full time as well, and you've got young children, or not young children, but youngish children. So, you know, this is, you know, it's, you know, pretty incredible that you've, you know, written 8 books as well as doing all that. Is it, you know, is it sort of, do you think there'll ever be will there be ever a time that you would like to just write?
I think it goes right back to what we said at the start about libraries being in your heart. I'm
Yeah.
not sure I could leave libraries, Karen.
I did.
I know,
I still do this. I still do booky stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
you're still such a bookish person, Karen. Even looking at your backdrop there, you know, I
yeah,
think
yeah.
it stays in your heart, doesn't it? To be honest, I wish I had more time to read. I think that's what's got really squeezed for me. And thinking back to our lovely joyful days when we used to do our book review site together, you know, and reviewing all those books, it's not only finding that time to read a book, isn't it, but actually finding the time to think about it. And yeah, which hopefully you're able to do with what you do. But
I am. I was thinking it was 6 years ago. I think it must be 6 years ago that we started writing our blog together and thing. And I was thinking about how much life has changed in those 6 years. And actually, because you were still writing your series back then, so you've written your 2 sort of standalones as well. It's actually 3, isn't it? 3 standalones, because you had 4. Yeah. So it's amazing in that time that. So what's next? What are you working on now?
Do you know, I allowed myself a bit of time off at the start of the year, because I think sometimes you drift, don't you, and you sort of lose your focus a bit. And one of the things I've always had a problem with is because I love books of virtually every genre. I don't think there's many genres I don't like. So I'm like that classic magpie of, oh, you know, there's another shiny thing. I'll have a go at doing that. I'll have a go at doing that, you know. And I think I wanted to take some time just to focus it back in again.
Yeah.
I do always seem to go back to those sort of psychological thrillers. But what I'm trying to plot out at the moment is a young adult psychological thriller. I really love young adult books. I don't feel that they get plenty of recognition, but they don't get the right recognition sometimes, because I think so many adults love them too.
Yeah. Well, they call it crossover, don't they, as well? You know, that's what we used to call
it's a better name, isn't it, really? Yeah, I think young adult is a bit of a misnomer, really. It's just one of those great books that appeals to a really broad range of people. Whether that will go anywhere though, Karen, I don't know, because it does feel like a step out. I'm quite a naturally verbose writer. When I'm editing, I constantly having to pull all the stupid long words out, which is so bizarre because when I speak normally, I sound like this, you know. Just for some reason when I'm writing, all the long words come out. And obviously there's a sort of snappiness, I think, with those young adult crossover books that makes them page turners. Whether that's a skill of mine yet, I don't know.
I was thinking this one's pretty fast paced, actually. I read it I think I read it in 2 sittings because it's really easy to get into. It's really great, you know, you get into it really quickly because you find out, you know, that something's not right pretty early on in the book, and that sort of makes you want to read on. And then as you start to read on, more and more things sort of become revealed, which makes you want to read on a bit more. And then it gets really creepy and dark when she goes in the tunnel. And the tunnel, I was fascinated because I've always loved, I think as a kid, I loved the sort of smuggling, you know, Jamaica in and those sorts of things. And, you know, that sort of going down to the, you know, and I was sort of wondering, you know, how you sort of view, you know, when you were writing, how you sort of got that in your head of the tunnel, because I had the tunnel in my head and I don't know what the tunnel looked like in your head. But
I think it touched on what I said earlier about that fascination with caves in general. I'm sure it's Freudian. I'm sure you can read buckets.
I'm sure it's probably
but I can just still remember that feeling as a kid. We did a lot of cave tours for some reason when I was a kid. Whenever we went on holiday, there was always a cave involved somewhere. And that feeling of like sort of awe, but also being quite scared. Like, you know, and it's that really sort of delicious scariness as a kid when you're sort of, you still feel quite safe, but it's like, oh, this is a bit creepy. And I do wonder if that's why I'm continually drawn back to that sort
of really interesting.
That sense, well, it's a sense of things hiding down there in the dark, isn't it? But it's also that sense of real ancient history and of other people passing through, you know, like ancient ancestors around their campfires. You know, there's there's just something about those places. I think they're got
Yeah,
oodles of atmosphere, haven't they?
it's also the dampness, isn't it? I was thinking, like, when I was a kid, I went to Morwellham Quay, and you
I
went
love
down
that
in like
place. Yeah,
you went down like in a on a on a train that went
I
down
know it
under the
well. Yeah.
and I remember that I was probably about, I don't know, 10 or 11, and the water was dripping, like it was in the sort of summer, but it was our
Yeah.
summer, so it was wet, and you've got that sort of dripping, and then like something dripped down the back of your neck, and you're like immediately, oh, what was that?
It is, and they always feel the same temperature, don't they? Regardless of whether it's hot or cold. I think there's something,
Yeah.
they are actually the same temperature pretty much all year round, or something weird like that. But
Mm.
yeah, they're just otherworldly places, I think. One of the few places that feels really alien in our world.
And you almost sort of touch on horror, don't you, in this one slightly as well, because of what happens to her when she goes in the tunnel. I don't want to give too much away, but it does sort of encroach into that sort of horror-esque, something happens to her, and it sort of, I thought it was a bit sort of Lady Macbeth, but a bit more dark.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, without saying too much, with the fingernails.
Yes.
I have, full confession, Karen, I've got a really weird phobia about fingernails. I don't know if
I
you can
was
see, I cut mine really, really short. I can't bear. It's the ripping of,
Oh,
like,
really?
even thinking about it. Yeah. So again, that's just a personal phobia that totally leached out on the page there, I think.
That's really, actually, now thinking about it, all thinking about all the fingernail things as well that happen in the book. Actually, I can sort of understand. I can, oh yeah, that's that all sort of neatly clicks into place, which I can't say anything about here. But if you read the book, you'll understand why the fingernails have, lots of different reasons. But yeah, that was quite dark, and sort of, there was bits where I was like, eee.
Well,
And was that fun?
yeah,
Was that fun to write?
I'm sure I read something years and years ago about that being a thing. And I'm sure I could share this bit. It's a section in the book where she's down in the cave and someone has embedded a really sharp fingernail in the wall to sort of scare off the Nixie.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that was a thing, but I couldn't find the original source. So
Ah.
yeah, it's really frustrating. But obviously it's stuck in my head wherever I read it.
Well,
Whether
if you
it was,
didn't, I was like, when I was reading, I was like, this is dark. Like the grubby finger. I mean, yeah, that sort of grubby fingernail really sort of made me a bit squeamish. Like the
yeah,
thought, when sort of, yeah.
fingernails.
But do you think those sort of like those things definitely sort of come out of your subconscious into the book? You definitely sort of, put that in, even if you're like, afterwards you might read it and think, oh, well, actually that's because of, my fingernail phobia. But actually, maybe when you're first writing it, you don't sort of think of it like that.
Yeah, I think so. I think as a writer, I make a really conscious effort. I never use people I know,
Yeah,
because I think
I'm glad
that's
about that.
not really fair, is it? But yeah, I think those subconscious things, the subconscious fears, the places, definitely the places you've been to,
Yeah.
stuff like that. I don't think there's a writer on this planet who can fail to bring a bit of themselves to the
Mm.
book. It's just, I think that's probably why people write, isn't it? It's just cathartic. It sort of works it all
Yeah.
on the page.
And I think it's interesting when people sort of say that when they read back their characters, or characters surprise them, and whether that's because they sort of think they've got a view of them, but then actually your subconscious sort of seeps into that in one way or another, and that's the surprise, is that you just didn't remember that, or you weren't, because it's like funny, isn't it, when your brain is silent, that's quite often where you get that clarity. We were talking about brain fog the other day, and I was just having that clarity sometimes of just thinking and thinking, oh yeah, that's probably where that came from. Or
That's a really interesting thing, I think, Karen. Maybe writing as a therapy for the menopause.
yeah.
Maybe that's what I need. Do a bit more writing to get the clarity again. Yeah, there probably is something in that though, isn't there? Yeah, sort of the orderliness of things on a page as opposed to burbling around in your brain.
Well, I think as well as you get older as well, you've got so much in your brain, haven't you, that you don't obviously tap into on a daily basis, but it's still there at the back somewhere. Or so I guess it's just, it's interesting that actually does sort of come out, because it is still in there. It's just it's like at the back of the filing cabinet as such.
Yes, just like that film, isn't it? Was it Inside Out? Have you seen that fabulous kids film? Yeah, when you got random jingles from the 1980s stored away.
But isn't it how you remember weird songs that you haven't heard for years, but when you heard them like every day when you were like 12, but now you remember all the words, and you're like, how do I remember all the words? I can't even remember what I did yesterday.
I know the amount of times I think that my brain, like 75%, is taken up with useless information.
Yeah, I
think you can't just sort of filter it out, isn't it?
Download it all somewhere on another disc and then like have a clear one. It would be great, wouldn't it?
Maybe that's what books are, downloading it all.
So you said you hadn't had a chance to read much, and I know we always used to talk about books and what we'd read. And so is there anything you've read recently that you've enjoyed? Do you still get sent things?
There was a book I read recently. I'm trying to remember what the author is called. It's called The List.
Oh, is it purple?
Okay, I think
it's purple.
It's got like an emoji face on it.
Yeah.
That was one I got off my library app on the train, and I got absolutely absorbed by it because it's such a beautifully simple premise, but you're constantly shifting your sympathies in it. And it's just about this golden couple a month before they're about to get married, and then someone leaks a list online of abusers, and the husband-to-be's name is on it. So this fabulous premise that just sort of explodes everything. So I definitely recommend that. Gosh, what else have I read? I read quite a creepy one recently. Have you heard of Nod by Adrian? Oh gosh, what's his surname? I want to say Adrian Barnes. Sort of a post-apocalyptic thing again, but it's where people can't sleep.
Oh,
really
you like
sinister. Yeah, I didn't like that
at all. Don't you? You didn't like it.
Well, I know. I thought it was brilliantly written, very sort of acerbic as well. Quite an unusual sort of tone in that one. So those are the two that spring to mind. Have you read Yellowface?
No, I've got it here somewhere.
That's a good one.
Is it?
Near the top of the pile, Karen. That was another absolute page turner.
That's set in the publishing world, isn't it? It's won loads of awards and things. Yeah, no, it looks really interesting. Yeah.
What about you? Any recommendations, Karen?
Oh, blimey. I've got so many. so many. There's so many on here. I read so much now that for just, for here. What have I read recently that I really loved? Well, The Depths, actually. I really enjoyed that one.
Thanks, Karen.
And I'm reading this isn't a crime actually, but it's called the Fellowship of the Puzzle Makers by Samuel Burr.
Yes, you posted about that recently. I saw it.
And that's really lovely. It's a sort of set around a community of puzzle makers. It's quite a really different sort of premise, but it's a group of people who sort of come together and they end up sharing something really special. And then the story is about so they get a child left on the doorstep, and then he's now an adult, and the lady who found him passes away, and then you sort of follow his quest to find out where he actually came from. It's not crime at all. Sorry, crime.
It's got a good title as well. I think that's definitely one that will catch your attention. Right, I made a note of that one.
Your go-to, do you have like a go-to author that you sort of pick up? I know we liked CJ Tudor, didn't we? Have you read her latest one? I
haven't yet. No, I'm going through a bit of a phase of I either use my library app or I raid the charity shops, and I think there's quite a lot of freedom in that, isn't there? Of just saying, "Oh, that looks interesting," and just grabbing it. So I've been doing a lot of that recently, but now my children are the age they are, they're now giving me recommendations too, which is which is
Yeah.
fab, really. It's yet another source of good recommendations.
And what's that? Do they like? Are they sort of into crime, or are they sort of? Because I know my kids used to like the what were they called? They're the Robert Muchamore series, which was Cherubs,
Oh,
which was a
yes.
sort of secret organization. But yeah.
Oh, well, they're both really into, Kazuo Ishiguro, who did like
Yes.
Remains of the Day, and so
Yeah.
they've got me into all of those. And I have to admit, his writing is just
Yeah.
he's one of those writers you just think, how does he do it? Just
Yeah.
teach me, someone teach me. Brilliant,
So
restrained.
he would be one of your go-tos because he did that lovely little book about the library. I think it's called The Strange Library, isn't it? And
Oh
it's
no,
sort of
that was Murakami.
oh, am I getting my I'm
Both
getting my
boys
people
are
muddled
also
up.
obsessed
Oh
with.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm getting them muddled.
Murakami's fantastic as well. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really good. Well, I'm looking at the time and it's nearly time to go. So before we go, did you want to tell us one more time about The Depths and why we should read it?
Well, it's if you like your psychological thrillers to be quite disturbing and more than a little bit damp, I think that's definitely how I describe The Depths, and set in hostile, unwelcoming Cornwall.
It's a perfect holiday read if you're going to Cornwall.
It certainly is. Yeah, just don't read it late at night, definitely, and not near a cliff or a cave.
No. Or water.
Yeah.
Or near fingernails. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Lucy. It's been a pleasure to talk to you as ever. And The Depths is out now, available on it's on Kindle. It's on can you buy? Is it available in paperback as well?
It is, yeah. I think via just Amazon at the moment. I think.
Yeah. So and it was yesterday. It was bestseller in folklore, wasn't it? So you don't
imagine
want to
how
turn
that
down.
made my heart sing. Yeah, that particular category.
Well, to be honest, a bestseller is a bestseller. It doesn't matter, does it, where it is?
Oh, I'll take it. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Karen. Yeah, it's been
Thank you,
lovely
everybody,
talking
for
to
joining
you.
us. And we will see you all again soon.
Yeah, catch up with you soon. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.